In the summer of 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt went on a 3-day camping trip with the naturalist vagabond John Muir in California's Yosemite Valley. They hiked and toured one of America's most beautiful landscapes and then sat around the campfire talking for hours. This became the single most important camping trip in the history of conservation, as it propelled Roosevelt to go on a crusade saving more land and natural wonders than any person in human history. But why did Roosevelt feel the need to devote his presidency to such a cause? Well, that's the treasure we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. What grabs your eye in this photo? The magnificent and commanding Roosevelt, the more mild Muir, his impressive beard, or like me, are your eyes drawn to the periphery and background, to the natural beauty that they stand against? This photo was taken on that famous camping trip with John Muir and President Theodore Roosevelt at Yosemite Valley as they stand here at Glacier Point. Maybe already you can see what could have driven Roosevelt to take action after this trip to save this beautiful place, but we're going to be digging deeper. But before we get knee-deep in the past, our exploration question for today's story lecture is, what impact did Roosevelt's camping trip with John Muir have on his presidency? And what other reforms did President Roosevelt champion? So let's get digging. We got some history to shovel first. Roosevelt was a born naturalist who had an affinity for nature and adventure since he was a child, but he was actually a sickly kid who struggled mightily with asthma. He spent days on end in his bed, too weak to get up. But with guidance and support from his father, whom he loved and admired deeply, he learned to battle against the weakness within him and to overcome it. Throughout his whole life, he seemed to muscle against any of his shortcomings and put his whole character on the line to prove his strength and his manliness, maybe even to the point of stupidity, but heck, I love it. I mean, he once delivered a speech on the need to embrace danger and turbulence in the battle to win manly achievements after he was shot in the chest and was still carrying the bullet from the would-be assassin. Then he fainted on stage and was rushed to get medical attention. Vintage Roosevelt. Earlier though, he was rising in politics during the Gilded Age, and in the era of machine corruption, Roosevelt was an independent-minded reformer who had little patience for those that he felt were misusing their power for their own benefit. Starting out as a New York politician, he bumped heads with many Tammany Hall Democrats, and even some of his fellow Republicans who he felt were not fighting hard enough to make change. Eventually, he rose to the ranks of Secretary of the Navy, a position of considerable authority, but he stepped down when the nation went to war with Spain because he wanted to be in the action on the front lines when his country needed him. Though criticized for the move, he raised the volunteer force of cowboys, athletes, Black and Native Americans, known as the Rough Riders, to fight the Spanish in Cuba. And Roosevelt himself led the daring charge, full steam into enemy fire during the Battle of San Juan Hill. It was right out of a Hollywood movie. His heroics made him a beloved national figure. However, his celebrity worried many in his Republican Party. The leaders of the party were worried sick that this young cowboy would make a run for the White House and become president. So they devised a plan. They could use Roosevelt's celebrity and popularity to help a machine man, William McKinley, win the election for president in the 1900 election, and then keep Roosevelt as vice president, where he would have no real power or no real authority and would hopefully just fade into obscurity. But when McKinley was assassinated just a year into his second term, the man who was never supposed to be president, this reckless cowboy and dangerous reformer, was thrust into the power of the presidency and quickly grew a liking for that power. And in the midst of Roosevelt's presidency, developments that had been taking place for generations were speeding up and putting some of America's greatest national treasures at risk. The openness and sheer scope of America's beautiful landscapes had always made an impression on the American psyche and mindset. Our first real unique artists came from the Hudson Valley School in the mid-1800s that, unlike the esteemed portraits of Renaissance Europe, the Hudson Valley School artists painted the beauty of America herself, from Niagara Falls, the open plains, and everything in between. Americans had pride in their country's vast lands and abundant resources. But Americans historically also had a drive to use those natural resources. They ripped up native grasses to plant wheat, corn, and cotton. They cleared forests to plant cash crops and raise cattle, and blew away mountainsides to mine silver, copper, and gold, and to run railroads. And as the country industrialized with aggression, the speed and velocity of development led John Muir to devote his life to preserving the wild spaces of America. John Muir was a Scottish immigrant who was brought to America as a child, where he too was touched early on by the beauty of Americans' lands. And as steel, concrete, and cities churned out at astonishing speed, Muir tried to lead a counter-revolution against the Industrial Revolution that saw nature not as something to be harvested for profits, but as a treasure unto itself to be preserved and cared for. As America's top naturalist, Roosevelt as president wrote to Muir, asking him to be his guide in Yosemite Valley that was for so long Muir's home. Roosevelt wrote, "I do not want anyone with me but you. And I want to drop politics absolutely for 4 days and just be out in the open with you." Now, Muir was not much for politics, but he realized if he could make an impression on Roosevelt, or better yet, if the valley itself could, his dream of saving Yosemite forever from the axe might be realized. Muir stated, "I might be able to do some forest good in freely talking around the campfire," because he knew that Roosevelt was already making unprecedented moves as president, and maybe he could usher in even more. Roosevelt became a new type of president in a new century at the dawn of a new age. He had the energy and charisma to match the moment, and the courage to take back the reins of power in the country that had for a generation really been in the hands of big business. The trusts that dominated the economy were seen as above the law and even beyond the reach of the president, but Roosevelt was intent on reining them in. Taking executive action against any trust he felt unfairly controlled the market or misused its power, Roosevelt was dubbed the Trust Buster. The first trust Roosevelt took on was owned by the nation's wealthiest banker and one of the most powerful people in the world, J.P. Morgan. With his actions against Morgan's Northern Security Company that controlled nearly all the railroads in the North, Roosevelt broke it up and showed the country and business leaders that even the richest man was not above the law. Roosevelt went on to break up 44 trusts, but actually left some in place that he thought were good trusts that operated for the public's benefit. Roosevelt also was the first president to side with union workers during a strike. The Pennsylvania coal strike was leading to a national emergency as winter set in and fuel was running low. Though it was seen as not really a problem for the president to solve, Roosevelt stepped in and eventually sided with the workers in the showdown. He told the owners that if they didn't agree to some of the terms of the strikers, he would nationalize the mine and send in the National Guard to mine the coal. Roosevelt's threat eventually led to a settlement, getting a raise in pay and reduced hours for the workers, and the president's popularity grew with the working men and women of the country. And that brings us to Dad Jokes in History! How did Roosevelt decide on which monopolies to break up and which to leave in place? How? Honestly, it was the ones that he thought were untrustworthy. Get it? Roosevelt also took action to protect consumers from dangerous practices. After reading the muckraking novel The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, Roosevelt, like millions of other Americans, was absolutely aghast to learn about the horrendous conditions in slaughterhouses that provided much of the nation's meat. Here Sinclair describes some of the common practices in industrial meat production at the time. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor, in the dirt and sawdust. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. This is no fairy story and no joke. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. Yikes. And to this, Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act that regulated the safety of consumer medicines and foods. American capitalism was finally being held to account. And these actions made up 2 of Roosevelt's 3 C's that characterized his progressive agenda: control of corporations, breaking up of the bad trusts; consumer protections, the Pure Food and Drug Act; and what might be his most important legacy, conservation of resources. And this was about to be cemented by 3 of the best nights of his life in Yosemite Valley. When Muir met Roosevelt at Yosemite Valley on May 15, 1903, it was the meeting of the most popular person in America with the nation's leading naturalist, in a time when it was far from cool, popular, or even pretentious to be a tree-hugging environmentalist. Muir took Roosevelt on hikes around Yosemite's most beautiful areas, Sentinel Dome, Glacier Point, El Capitan, and gazed upon native birds, gushing waterfalls. They stood under the great sequoias and gazed over miles of valleys and the endless Sierra Nevada mountains. You can imagine the delight, the awe, the inspiration in their eyes as they toured the area. Roosevelt was in heaven. Despite a small snowstorm and falling temperatures, the next morning Roosevelt and Muir woke up early, drank what looked like a gallon of coffee, and set off for another full day of adventure. They toured miles upon miles of the valley on horseback that day. And it was that second night that the 2 sat and talked for hours on end around the campfire. In their discussions, Muir spoke of the necessity of federal action to protect Yosemite and other lands from the lumbermen, miners, and developers. And in the wee hours of the night, these 2 men hashed out the future of America's National Park Service. Roosevelt left the trip saying to a reporter who asked him about it, "It was bully. I had the time of my life." Roosevelt returned to Washington with a determined spirit to go all in on conservation. The same powers that he yielded to break up the trusts, to regulate industries, and negotiate the coal miner strike, he now would use to forever protect the open lands of the West. He signed the Antiquities Act, which gave the president power to create national monuments on federal lands. He went on to save 147 million acres of forest reserves, 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 55 bird sanctuaries, and 150 national forests. More importantly, he set the precedent that allowed future presidents to conserve even more land and to create even more national parks. And Muir and Roosevelt helped to change the culture in America in respect to nature. They helped to create a culture that has pride in the protection of our open and wild spaces, what Muir called the temples of nature. And just as the Declaration and Constitution serve as the birthright to future generations, so too will Yosemite, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, and so many others. And with a warming planet and a myriad of environmental problems facing land, sea, and air, I fear as we Americans turn more and more towards screens, phones, and virtual environments that we might neglect our open spaces and our duty to protect them. So I challenge you to find some wild spaces to get lost in soon. As Muir stated, of all the paths you take in life, make sure a few of them are dirt. So go uphold your civic duty and get dirty. Thanks for engaging in history today. This has been History for Humans. And hey, thanks so much for watching the episode. And if you liked it and learned something, could you click the thumb that looks like this? And you can hit subscribe and get updates on our new episodes that will be dropping regularly. And for teachers and homeschool parents, I have lessons and resources to go with all of my videos on my website, historyforhumans.com. So you can go there and save yourself a lot of time, stress, and energy, and just enjoy exploring history with your students. And if you're doing a learning activity that you can find on my website, hang out because I got instructions in just a sec. Okay, today's lesson is packing heat, so get your pens and oven mitts ready for this fire. The first part, you're going to read an awesome primary source. It's a speech from President Roosevelt about the need to conserve our open lands. You will then answer some comprehension and some critical thinking questions about the speech. Then part 2, you're really going to like because you're going to be able to think creatively, artistically, and originally. You're first going to learn about the National Park Service logo and learn what it symbolizes. Then you're going to design your own logo to replace the Park Service one for the new century. You're going to need to think about what images that you're going to include and then define what they symbolize. You do not need to be a fantastic artist to do well on this. Simplicity can be really powerful here. All right, act like geologists on this one and rock it.